Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you for getting up this morning, a chilly morning, to be out talking about issues that are really going to heat up in the new year. Senator, you are truly the perfect person to be talking to about this subject at this moment in time. I want to hear from you both from your legislative perspective as well as your experience as an MD. But if you first just sort of set the stage for me to talk a little bit about the importance that biologics and biosimilars may have in the future of treatment, of patient care. Give me an idea how important this is.
David McCulloch, who wrote so many great biographies of our statesmen, was asked what would be written of our era. He said, what will be written of our era is medical advances. This will be one of those things written of. When Janet Woodcock at the FDA spoke before our committee, she, as a rheumatologist, says that when she was in clinical practice, the waiting room would be full of wheelchairs, those disabled by their rheumatoid arthritis, and now no one has a wheelchair. As a gastroenterologist, in a room such as this, there's somebody with Crohn's disease. So I'm old enough to have this gray hair. When I was in medical school residency, you'd commonly have patients who had been in the hospital for months with Crohn's disease and with fistulas, and you would operate a bit, and you would take it out, and then it would go back where you had joined the bowel together. That's no longer seen. It's just like a disease which my wife as a general surgeon kind of filled up her book, now may only be operated on once or twice a year. So in an institution, I mean, among all the patients that you would have, this has truly revolutionized these biologics, the management of intractable diseases.
And the biosimilars, by turn, this is also going to change the market in its own way.
We would hope so. So, as we all know, biologics are 1% of the market, but 30% of the spend. That's an important statistic. 1% of the market, 30% of the spend. If we look at the small drugs, the small molecules, the traditional generic drugs, within, 12, 15 years of introduction of the Hatch-Waxman Act, they had about 85% market share. So you saw this rapid uptick, of course, a fall in the overall drug spend. Biologics probably is not going to work that well, but still, we can look at the UK. In the UK, they've had biosimilars introduced, and they now have, a little bit ahead of us, I think those biosimilars now have about 45% market share. Oh. So
45%.
Now, whereas though with a traditional small drug generic, you may get, if this is name brand, after it becomes generic, price falls precipitously. Best projections that with follow-on biologics, it may be a 30% discount. It won't be that sort of 80% discount.
At best.
At this point. That could change, but at best, at this point. So, at best, at this point. So,
no, but there is research that indicates it might be considerably less than 30%. I mean,
the more competitors you have, and the more likely you can interchange, the more likely prices will fall. The intro mentioning that guidance on interchangeability is still out there. The structure of the studies required to allow interchangeability will be complex studies, as I understand them to be, most likely to be demanded, and they'll be expensive and they'll take a long time. All that will delay that sort of, do I use drug A or drug B today? And next time, do I use B or A? It will never be quite as simple as that. When I get, what medicine do I always see that just flips back and forth? Motrin. You buy Motrin, and Motrin has one shape or that shape. It's ibuprofen something else, it's Motrin that. But it's the same drug, even though every time you take it from a different manufacturer, it has a different appearance. It won't be quite that, not for some time, that seamless when it comes to biologics.
Right, because the biosimilars are not generics in the sense that we look at the small molecule drugs, and these are replicable in a chemical sense in a way that the biosimilars cannot be to the biologics. Just by definition, we're not aiming at that. And I just want to clarify that distinction between the generics and the biosimilars.
You know, imagine, not to be anything, but imagine you go to a town where it's been geographically isolated for some time and the population is substantially inbred. And you look around and everybody kind of looks the same. Because everybody's closely related.
Is that Washington you're talking about?
So in a biologic, if I have an infusion of a biologic, it's like that town in which everybody's closely related. Not quite the same, but you can tell they're closely related because the proteins, even within the same infusion, will have variability. And that variability means that what's going in is a little different. So now the drug that would be a follow-on would also be a little different from this. It raises the question, if your concern is about immunologic reactions to proteins which are a little bit different, well, the originator drug, the reference product, is inherently a little different from itself every batch. Every batch you get will be a little different than the previous batch. So there's always this risk for immunogenicity. Whether or not the FDA is overstating it or not, we just don't know.
All right, let's walk to the other side of your expertise and experience, and that is up the street on the Hill. Of course, the elephant in the room for this city right now is all the changes that will come about after January 20th. And obviously, the ACA is on the table. You've made some proposals as well. For those who don't know, the BPCIA was attached to the original ACA. How is that going to change whatever changes are made to ACA, repeal, overhaul, whatever you want to call it?
I can imagine this provision would be one of those kept, kind of carved out, if you will. Everyone recognizes part of the problem with the ACA is that it was so comprehensive, it became so big that it became, what's the word? Oh, just hard to kind of totally implement. But that said, there's some provisions of it which are kind of unrelated to the direct hands-on of a patient or the direct financing of a patient. Related, but not directly related. So I can imagine this would be one of those provisions that would be kept.
Your expectation and your recommendation, would there be any changes in the BPCIA?
I'd have to go back and kind of fine-tooth comb, but put it this way. They're already this many years into it. And this is something which is quite technical, involving the regulatory agencies and industry. So this is not really the core of what people think of when they talk about Obamacare. When they think of Obamacare, they think of the exchanges, they think of skyrocketing premiums, they think of the government telling them what to do. They're not thinking about what are we doing with the follow-on biologic. So
the regulatory thing is outside the picture.
In terms of this, yes.
All right, then let's talk about the BPCIA and its effectiveness so far. I mean, in these years, we have now seen 4 reach through the process. 4 biosimilars have been approved. Only one of them, I believe, is on the market already, right? So is this working the way it's supposed to?
That's almost an imponderable. Janet Woodcock, we had an oversight hearing in December of 2015. And one example, the statistical analysis guidance, I asked directly, when will that be available? And she said that it would be available within 6 months. And so this is September 15, and it's not available yet. So in that sense, it's not working. Industry says they need to know this. The statistical analysis that lets them know how much variability that they're allowed to have in a product is not yet there.
How similar does the biosimilar have to be?
In that sense, the statistical analysis part of that. So we are over a year out from, almost a year out from the kind of deadline we were given. So in that sense, it is not working. On the other hand, we have to recognize that this is truly a complex area, which is evolving as we speak. And so I have to cut a little bit of slack to the agency. Dr. Woodcock's position is that if they do it wrong on one of the earlier biologics, that will destroy physician and patient confidence in the process and may retard uptake going forward. Well, I can get that too. So no.
The experience of generics is somewhat similar. I mean, it does take some evolution to bring the public on board.
Well, and I think there was an initial drug which its bioavailability was not the same as the original drug, and so there were some initial problems. So it's not working as it should. Is that understandable, explainable, and acceptable for the short term, perhaps? But we really would like to start seeing some of the stuff which we were told would be available 8 or 9 months ago, available sooner.
In the areas of interchangeability, I mean, what do you hear from industry? What does the industry need to understand and know from the FDA? Where's that bridge?
Well, one, again, the statistical analysis, two, the ideas of the interchangeability, but I also think we need to look at the experience of others. There are, if you look in the medical literature, there are articles from around, whether it is in Japan or maybe Australia or UK, in which people are interchanging. And under physician pharmacy guidance, they're saying, okay, let's go with this drug, not that. And there have been no untoward effects. Efficacy is the same, side effects are no greater. That's really good. Now, just life being life, you know, some of them get changed back. I can just tell you, no one goes from A to B and stays on B forever. Inevitably, someone goes from A to B and then back to A. So one of the things we need to look at as a society is how do we use big data and post-market surveillance? I can already tell you that if we're going into a study in which we're going to have people multiply change back and forth, there's going to be one group which never changes and one group which goes back and forth and one group that goes back and forth more often. It's going to be an incredibly expensive study which is going to take years to do, and it is going to delay the introduction of all these drugs. The question is, can we do it a little bit differently? Can we look at the countries that have already started interchangeability and do post-market surveillance to get a sense of how well it's tolerated? We know they're making the original change. I presume, don't know for sure, presume that they're sometimes changing back. Will we end up with a group of patients we can just follow empirically and get an answer to some of our questions? Now, do we have to do this for every drug? I don't know, but I do think just to benefit our patients, to attempt to lower cost, we need to think creatively about how we can find the same, is it similar efficacy, or side effects no greater, in a different mechanism than a multi-arm crossover trial extending for years.
Related to that is the labeling itself. I mean, how much should I, as a patient, understand? How much clarity does there have to be? Because as you say, I mean, the biosimilars have certainly gotten a lot of attention and use in Europe and in some parts of Asia as well, I guess. So that has to lead to some concern for the patients. And if you talk about the patients having a sense of confidence in these drugs that are new to them, you know, what do we need to see? What does the FDA need to require there?
Well, when I tell people ask about patients, if you will, and I always, and physicians, and I always figure physicians and patients approach things with their head, their heart, and their pocketbook, okay? So really, if you have two studies and they show same drugs or similar drugs or similarly efficacious, no greater side effects, your head would say you can use either one. Your heart would say, wait a second, I've been on this one for a long time. Why would I change? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Unless your pocketbook tells you, if I change, I can save a lot of money. Now, just having been in practice and speaking with patients, I can tell you, your heart overrides the head unless the pocketbook is involved. So if it turns out that follow-on biologics will lower the cost to the patient, and the patient has some price exposure, she is incentivized to change from her pocketbook, then most likely, most cases, she will go with her head. And the physician will say, well, the best data is that you can change, that the side effects are not greater, but we will follow you closely, maybe even see you a little bit sooner than we normally would. And if you're doing well, then we will continue you on this new drug. So I do think there will be that process. FDA will need to go out and educate, be able to convince patients and doctors that it is similarly efficacious. It's a different story in China. I spoke to one person from industry. They want to put kind of a suffix which reflects their brand at the back of the drug.
A little four-letter add-on to whatever.
But it would definitely reflect who the manufacturer was. It wouldn't be a random set of letters and numbers. And their position is that when we go to China, the Chinese have more trust in American branded drugs than they do in Chinese. Makes sense. If you get heparin from a pig and bleed out in China, you're not going to be very confident in their drug manufacturing. So if they see something with an American company's suffix, they may be more likely to buy that one. Now, that makes sense too. But then in Dr. Woodcock's testimony, she said, well, what if one company sells their line to another company? Does the suffix go with them? So there is a complexity. And again, everybody's a little frustrated with the slow pace, but when you look at the issues, they're not straightforward.
Right. So, I mean, the example of that would be Sandoz, Novartis.
Yes.
What is it, really, if you're the consumer? And we will talk with a representative from Sandoz a little bit later as well. You know, that experience of having that trust, I mean, we've talked about the intangibles of difference to me as a patient, right? So I can understand if you tell me you're giving me a small molecule drug and the chemistry is there to have it as a generic, I can get that. But you've already told me that the biosimilar is going to be different. We've already, engaged on the edge of the patent dance thing, and whether we can really identify this as being how similar is this drug to that drug. How do you persuade the patient population? We know that it was difficult with generics. How do you do this with the large molecules?
Make them pay more for the original. I mean, I hate to be so totally cut to the chase, but again, pocketbook will sharpen, Samuel Johnson quote, nothing like a hanging to sharpen a man's mind. A patient called me, a former patient, her husband's a liver transplant patient, and she called me about a week ago, or no, a year ago, I'm sorry, whenever an open enrollment was. And she called up to say, my husband, remember? Yeah, of course I remember. He's on this drug for his anti-transplant, and it's going to cost us $2,000 a month. She's a very excitable person, wonderful person, big personality. It's coming through on the phone. Well, she later found out that if she went through her PBM for the generic, it would cost her $100 a month. Okay, well, she didn't think twice about it. She went for the less expensive. She could have said, wait a second, do I know that they're similarly efficacious? Or whatever question she would ask, smart woman, but not a nurse or a physician. But she would have asked sophisticated questions. But she went to that price. She could not afford the medicine otherwise. There was nothing else that mattered, because otherwise she absolutely could not afford it, and her husband would lose his liver transplant. So I think if you have Crohn's disease, you're at risk of it becoming active, and you cannot otherwise reasonably afford, you're going to be much more amenable to a substitution than if you're price insensitive. If you're price insensitive, again, you don't care what it costs.
So that brings me to Medicaid. You've been talking about this just in the last few days. You made some headlines on this. How does this sort of payer system impact what may happen with these kinds of technologies?
And elaborate a little bit more on that.
Well,
question.
You were talking about Medicaid in the last few days, and really, you might want to tell the audience what you've said about Medicaid. But
I've said so much about Medicaid, I don't know what I've said. I've talked to my wife about Medicaid, so anyway.
But you are certainly concerned about it.
Oh, Medicaid, I mean, the costs of Medicaid are exploding. And the expansion population, for example, costs more than the traditional population. They're flooding emergency rooms. We were told they would go to primary care doctors, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So that said, there's a lot of problems. Cost is going to be a problem for both the federal and the state taxpayer. Now, we want to have people covered, absolutely. These drugs are clearly a major driver of the spend state Medicaid programs are doing. So when you speak to either pharmacy benefit managers or state Medicaid directors, they have thoughts about how to address it. Would you do a stepwise therapy? There are some with Crohn's who could be managed on a non-biologic and managed well. So do you require that they go through that process of, okay, let's try something before we get there? You'd save a lot of money, and you'd always be able to step in with the biologic should it be needed. Now, I can tell you, it's a lot easier not to go through that. Here you have somebody who's having 12 bowel movements a day, they're bloody. She goes to work and all of a sudden she has to leave, and as she leaves, she has soiled her dress. That is a reality for somebody with Crohn's. If you can say, listen, we start this infusion and it stops, she will gravitate towards that. Then you can understand why. So would I, so would you. On the other hand, from the PBM's perspective, we can't do that for everybody. And we do know that if we give her a course over 3 or 4 months, we can control her with something which is an oral. She doesn't have to worry about infusions, and it will cover her at a fraction of the cost. That will be the tension. Now, isn't this interesting? I mentioned earlier, as long as someone is, their wallet will override their head and their heart, that is until you have a large bloody BM in the middle of work. And you end up in the emergency room in writhing pain with fevers. And someone tells you that you can get a fistula from your anus to your vagina. All this, I'm just telling you. All of a sudden you become, I don't care what it costs. I want this fixed. Now that is the absolute tension. So the PBMs, I'm sure, would like to have a stepwise approach. And there will be tension between the payors and the patient groups and the physicians who will feel as if someone is stepping in to their domain. That tension will have to be resolved. That's one example, and that would be a way that you could control cost, and people have proposed.
I kind of got away from what time it was, but we did want, if there are audience questions, to clearly there are audience questions on this subject. So, Senator.
Yes, hi, I'm a rheumatologist. So my name is Arthur Weinstein. I wanted to get your take on the switch issue. Can you switch? And how much does the United States have to rely on its own data versus Europe, which is so far ahead of us? So at our national meeting, which was here in Washington a month ago, there's this NOR switch. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's sponsored by the Norwegian government, where they showed that you can switch from infliximab to a biosimilar that's already on their market without untoward side effects and no change in efficacy. Now, they included everything under the sun that's treated with Remicade, not just one disease. But I think if you look at, the end result, it looks good. So are we going to have to reproduce that when Scandinavia is so far ahead of us in looking at their big data and all of that?
So there's a meta-analysis from the Annals of Internal Medicine. It came out late last year. I forget when it came out. But when I got it, I occasionally still read a medical journal. I dashed off an email to Dr. Woodcock, herself a rheumatologist, saying, listen, here's a meta-analysis. As follow-up to and a meta-analysis, for those less familiar with statistics, you take all the studies that are out there and you look at them simultaneously to see if they all come to the same conclusion. And they all came to the same conclusion that you could switch. So I sent to her and I said, listen, as follow-up of the oversight we had last September, this meta-analysis seems to suggest that we could. Does this advance our thinking? She wrote back, including information on that which you just described from Norway. But her point was, yes, it does appear that we can switch. The question is, can we switch back and switch back and switch back? So their concern, going back to the interchangeability study, and you and I know how much this is going to cost, but they want to apparently have a study in which you go back and forth, as if climbing up a mountain, switching back, switching back. So I agree with you, though. We should be able to use the big data from these registries in Europe. The other point she would make regarding the EU and us is that there's not necessarily bioequivalence of the drugs they are using, even though they have the same name. Now, she doesn't know that they're not, but still there's at least some difference in potency between drugs there and drugs here. And I think that gives them concern too. But I'm with you, man. I'm thinking big data. We can do post-market. Vioxx, everybody remembers Vioxx. It turned out after it was released that people were having heart attacks. And then they went back to the original data and they found some evidence for it. But it was post-market surveillance that gave them that information. Now, you can say, well, wait a second, Vioxx should have never come to the market. But there's a lot of other drugs. We can be consumed by existential anxiety. That which we do not know strike such fear in us that we never advance. There's an incredible opportunity cost there, incredible opportunity cost, because otherwise we'd never have these advances that keep somebody with Crohn's disease from never going to the emergency room rather than living a lovely life. You as a rheumatologist can tell many stories of somebody with diseases that would have left her arms like this, and instead she has no deformity at all. So we have to make sure that we don't have an incredible opportunity cost as we try and ensure the safety.
Other thought from the audience? Sir. Oh.
Hi, Nick Florka with Inside Health Policy. Thanks. I'm wondering, with the biosimilar user fee agreement coming up for reauthorization, what policies you envision Congress tacking on to that related to biosimilars when that comes up next year?
I can't really answer that. My staff and I are going through that. We are very concerned about the high cost of drugs, and we think there should be market-based solutions. So I've been looking at all the kind of FDA reauthorization more right now from the perspective of the high cost of medicine. Can't say we have any solutions. It's just such a massive problem. There's no single answer. You got to kind of, nibble around the edges, and hopefully collectively you've made an impact. So that's where our focus has been, and I digress. To come back to your point, quite likely some of our considerations will come to these biologics, but it'll probably be more on the price aspect. Because FDA has been unable to release some of this in a more timely fashion, we may look at how to encourage them to perhaps release in a more timely fashion. But it is such of a technical nature that at some point you're dependent upon the FDA. Congress cannot write a paper on how to do statistical analysis.
Well, unfortunately, we are not out of interest, but out of time. I appreciate your talking
Well, thank you
with us
very
about
much.
this.
Thank you.